Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet.
This review covers the B-50D Superfortress. It's a 172 scale Academy kit number 2112, released back in 1992, but still available online and at garage sales everywhere. Now, the B-50D was destined to be the last piston-powered bomber used by the Air Force, and it was upgraded. It was an upgraded version of the Boeing B-29 with more powerful Pratt & Whitney engines and a stronger structure and taller tail fin. Now, after the jet-powered B-47 was introduced, the B-50s were phased out, and over 200 were converted into tankers and recon aircraft and used until 1965. Now, the kit has about 240 pieces molded in gray styrene with 12 pieces on a clear sprue. And when you're done, it'll be about 23.5 inches wingspan size, 16.5 inches in length, and 5.5 inches high. The first thing to do is to wash the parts in some mild soap detergent and warm water, rinse them off and let them air dry. Now, we'll be using liquid cement for most of the construction, and sometimes clear glue or a white glue for the canopy. But please remember to heed any of the manufacturer safety and use guidelines when you're using any of the products that you see or hear mentioned in the review. The decals have a nice register and the color is good, and they're fairly opaque. But you'll find using some of the setting solutions helpful to make sure that they conform to panel lines and rivets, etc. One thing that I noticed about the kit was that the outboard engine nacelle marking locations were pretty nice, but the inboard ones were very shallow and indistinct, and so it was hard to locate the inboard nacelles there. But I'll show you how that's aligned using other things on the wing to determine position. One other inconsistency of note is that the engines appear to be somewhat simplistic. It almost looks like there are 7 cylinders on this engine, when in fact the B-50 was powered by 28-cylinder engines. So I guess you have to use your imagination and just use it as a representation of the engines. Construction begins with fuselage preparation, and we're going to paint the interior of the fuselage interior green, that's FS 34151, and some medium gray, which is FS 35237. Now, the interior green is a Model Master 1715, and the gray is 1721. Now we can detail some of the interior parts that you see here. They assemble into 3 compartments: the cockpit, the midship gunners, and the tail gunners area. The interior of each compartment is painted overall medium gray, with seats, seat belts, control columns, bunks, etc. picked out in various colors, as you see. And the seats and the blankets are dark brown. That's Model Master 2111, and the seat belts are tan, which is Model Master 1742. And the sheets on the bunks are white, which is a Tamiya flat white XF2, and various shades of red, blue, yellow, and black add a bit of color here and there. Now, once the fuselage is together, however, you will never see these pieces, so it's up to you on how much detail to add. Use the bulkhead pieces, as you see here, to provide some of the detailing there, but you have to keep in mind that the sides of the bulkheads are different colors. For example, part A65, the rear bulkhead for the pilot's compartment, it's medium gray on the cockpit side, but interior gray on the reverse side. And so that makes it the forward bulkhead of the bomb bay area. Likewise, part A71, which makes up the rear bulkhead of that area, is interior green, while the opposite side is the forward bulkhead of the gunner and crew rest compartment, and it's medium gray. Various cockpit side panels, for like parts D63 and 34, are painted flat black before attaching them to the side of the fuselage. There's also some parts here that need to be assembled and painted interior green. The long piece at the top is the tunnel that allowed the crew to move between the 2 pressurized compartments, the cockpit and the gun crew areas. though non-pressurized in the bomb bay. And in the real aircraft, there was a wheeled cart on which the crewmen laid down, pulled themselves from one compartment to the other, using an overhead rope. These parts, like part B-66, need to be assembled and painted before the two compartments are added to the fuselage. Now the wing spar box is made up of parts A-20, 21, and 22, and this needs to be painted interior green as it'll be visible through the open bomb bay doors. From experience, I've found that it's easier, that the bomb bay racks and the bombs are easier to install with the fuselage halves separate than try and put them in there with it all closed up. Now the tunnel and gunner crew rest compartment also have to be added after the bomb racks are installed. Construction of the bomb requires assembling the 64 bomb halves together. Cleaning any mold lines and glue seams is, tedious, but unless you close the bomb bay door, you can see them. So the racks were painted interior green, although the instructions call for silver. Now I could find no reference photos of the B-50 bomb bay, and I simply figured they would be painted the same color as the interior of the bomb bay. The bombs themselves were painted olive drab, and they may have had yellow stripes on them, but I didn't include those on my version. Here you see, once all of those parts are assembled, I added as much weight as I could using some solder to make sure that I could close the fuselage around the weights as a mock-up. And I cut them into each area, but they call for 84 grams of nose weight, 3 ounces, to prevent the tail from sitting down. But I couldn't get that much weight into the area under the cockpit. And it shows the cockpit and the weights installed, as well as the bomb racks and bombs. The gunner crew rest area and tunnel have not yet been added. Here's a tip for aircraft builders. To find out how much weight you need to keep one of the aircraft with tricycle gears from sitting on their tail, I put all the major components together, mock them up. Using some blue tack, poster putty, I attach the land gear, add the wheels, and sit the model on a flat surface. Then I add weight wherever I can, till I can get the model to sit properly on the landing gear. I knew that I needed some more weight for this model, so I looked for places where it might go, and I thought maybe the engine nacelles might work, but they were far enough forward, so that they would actually help keep the landing gear in place. So the engine nacelles halves were assembled, the seams cleaned up, and the engines were painted interior green for the firewall and silver for the cylinders, dark gray for the gearbox and ignition harness. Now remember, your kit includes 2 sets of engine fronts, so use the 7-cylinder engine fronts. Now the engines were then fixed in place for each nacelle, and then I searched for some weight. To my surprise, pennies fit in there perfectly, so I added 7 pennies to each nacelle. Now the pennies in the nacelle plus the solder under the cockpit provided enough weight to keep the model from tail sitting. Let's move on to the props now. And the first, each prop was sprayed flat white. And then after the white had dried, each tip is then sprayed flat yellow. I used Tamiya's XF3. And once it's dry on each tip, it gets masked, and all of the blades are sprayed gloss black. Lastly, the blades were then completely masked off, and the center hub was sprayed with some Model Master chrome silver. While the paint on the props was drying, I then assembled the wing halves, the stabilizer halves and the vertical stabilizer, the rudder there, and they're essentially the upper and lower pieces of each wing half. Just glue them together, and remember to paint the interior of the main gear bay interior green before closing up the wing. Also make sure the 2 holes that attach under the wing fuel tanks are not flashed over. If they are, just use a small drill or the tip of your X-Acto blade to open those up. These are simply just glued together, and the seams are cleaned up with sand sticks after they've dried. The same with horizontal stabilizers. Just 2 halves, glue them up, and clean up the seams, and then add the clear parts to the inside of the vertical stabilizer, the rudder, before gluing the 2 halves together there. The clear parts could be added later, but it's easier to do it at this point. And use some of the crystal clear or white glue for the clear parts. And once the glue on the clear parts had dried, I masked the clear parts, and I used some liquid mask to cover those up to prevent them from being painted. Now the wings, the engine nacelles, the horizontal stabilizers, and the vertical stabilizers can just be set aside now to dry until later. Once you've got the cockpit installed on one half of the fuselage, it's time to join the two fuselage halves, and it's important to pay attention to the two flat areas on the tunnel that run from the rear cockpit bulkhead to the forward bulkhead at the central crew station. One flat surface must go up, and the other piece will not fit under the small ridge below the observation and navigation dome. I'm not sure why there's a clear dome directly on top of a tunnel where you couldn't see it or get access to it, but it's there. Anyway, once the tunnel is inserted into the opening of the cockpit bulkhead, it can be inserted into the central crew compartment bulkhead too. You could attach a tunnel to both bulkheads and then insert the whole assembly into the fuselage, but I thought proper alignment would be easier if they were done separately. The last item that we'll add before closing the fuselage is the wing spar box, and closing that revealed quite a gap in the underside of the nose area, and it got progressively smaller as it moved back to the first bomb bay. So the gap may have been caused by the added weight, but I doubt it. Nonetheless, it resulted in wanting the smallest possible gap along that top of the fuselage, so figuring that the top would be much more visible than the underside, I concentrated on that. So I determined to fix the larger gap at the nose around the forwardmost observation blister there, and I just used a little stretched sprue to fill as much of the gap as possible. I like using that from the same kit because the plastic is the same as the surrounding stuff, and it sands just the same. The areas that weren't filled by the stretched sprue and the gap in the front of the bomb bay were finished off with some Tamiya putty. Now, very small gaps along the top of the fuselage were filled with the putty, thinned a little bit with some acetone, and some sanding with various grits of sandpaper and polishing with some micro mesh sponges got the fuselage ready for paint. We'll turn our attention to the main canopy. And because the aircraft will have a two-tone silver natural finish, I wanted that installed to make sure that the frames matched the surrounding fuselage color. So I prefer to mask the canopy with Tamiya tape that's cut into real thin strips. I first apply the tape along the horizontal frames, followed by the vertical frames. And once the frames are outlined, I used a brand new number 11 blade to carefully remove the small sections where the frames meet. And once this is accomplished, I then fill the areas of the canopy that are to remain clear with some more Tamiya tape. I wish I'd gotten more pictures for you, but once the canopy is attached, I then spray the Tamiya flat XF16 on the fuselage at the center section where the wings attach, and once that paint's dry, they're all masked. All the other areas are masked off in preparation for the rest of the silver paint. Now I used chrome silver 1790 in Model Master's catalog, and the photos show the outlining of the masked areas on the wings as well. But the process is the same also for the fuselage. Now the wheel wells, the bomb bays, and the engines were masked using moist bathroom tissue. Moist tissue allows for easy placement and it won't blow around so much from the airbrush. To prevent the overspray from getting inside the fuselage when you're spraying the chrome silver, I use some slips of paper that are curled around the inside of each observation blister and the gun turret location. And although the gun turrets aren't as critical, as nothing will be seen inside the areas once those turrets are added. Soon find out that natural metal finishes are difficult to use because the metallic paints reveal every flaw that's in the finish of the plastic. And this was the case in mine, as I found some sink marks on the kit that I really couldn't see or weren't real visible earlier. So I went back, filled some of the sink marks, but left some of the less subtle ones, and had to finish those off. Once those were cleaned up and some areas resprayed with the silver, the masking could be removed from the wings, tail surfaces, stabilizers, and the fuselage. The process for masking and painting a two-tone paint area for the tall surfaces, or for the tail surfaces, and the vertical stabilizers is the same for the wings. And once I was happy with the two tones of paint, the wings, fuselage, tail surfaces, and the vertical stabilizer were given 2 coats of Future spray. That's the Pledge Future, in preparation for the decals. While the main airframe was drying, I started to work with the wing tanks. The 2 halves are glued together and the seams are cleaned up. And in looking at the decals, it was pretty obvious they weren't designed to cover the entire front of the tanks. So this area would have to be painted by the modeler. So the first job was to spray each wingtip tank flat white, followed by a flat red. And the next was to decide how far back from the tip to extend that red area. The first attempt that I used was forward most of the panel lines on the wing tanks. Then I laid one of the decals alongside it, and it looked as if the red area was too short still. So I used a pair of dividers, proportional dividers, to measure the distance from the end of the decal to the rear tip of the wing tank, to the point where it would join the red tank tip if it was already painted. And once the red area was masked off properly, the tanks were sprayed chrome silver to match the bulk of the fuselage. When I went to start putting on the decals, I ran into a little problem. Apparently the age of the decals rendered them basically useless as they were. As you can see here, when I put on the splash stripes, the decal fell apart, disintegrated. So what I decided to do was just stop what I was doing, spray the entire decal sheet with a couple of coats of clear lacquer and let it dry thoroughly. And that works pretty good to keep the decals together, even when they're old like that. But you have to remember to trim the decals out, because basically you've got one big decal sheet now with a lot of clear portions in between. So you have to trim them out, but that way they'll stay together. So I went on to put the rest of the decals in place, and using some of the setting solutions, you can get them to conform pretty well to any of the details. So you see the tail fin here, and that worked out pretty well. Now there's an issue to remember as far as the instructions going to tell you about the stars and bars decals. So when you're placing the decals on the wings, the stars and bar decals go on the upper surface of the port wing, that's the left side, and the lower surface of the right hand, the starboard wing. And the USAF decal goes on the underside of the port wing and the upper surface of the starboard wing. So just so that you know, they were a little inconclusive there. Once all of the decals were applied to the wings, fuselage, and tail, I glued them, the wings, the stabilizers, and the horizontal stabilizers to the fuselage. Remember to scrape off any paint so you get a good bond. And there's nothing difficult about it. You just use your eyes and to make sure that they're all symmetrical and that they're glued properly. I used both plastic, cement, and some super glue where is needed to just get things started. And also some thin super glue to fill any of the major seams between the parts. I'll give this plenty of time to dry, and that way when you pick up the model you won't crack it. So it's time to move on now. Add a little realism to the model. A friend of mine went through his stash and found me some 172 scale decals of the Hamilton standard prop logos for the propellers. These are small decals, and they go in the same location on all 16 propeller blades. So I had to make a jig, and what you saw there was it's just a cardboard box, and it's got a hole in it for the prop shaft, and then a mark to indicate the line where the logos will be placed when you move that blade over it to then locate your logo decal. And then once all of that was done, you just apply some no smoking decals to the front of the landing gear doors, and sprayed the landing gear doors red, of course. And then when all of this is done, you can give the entire model and the props a coat of future floor polish to seal in the decals. Now we can move on to the landing gear, and it consists of 4 pieces and 2 tires. The tires come in 2 halves, and then you glue them together and clean up the seams. And then they're sprayed with chrome silver, as were the 4 landing gear pieces for each main landing gear. And once that has dried, on each tire the rubber was painted a rubber black. That's a Tamiya color XF85. To assemble the landing gear, remember to remove any paint before you glue them parts. And then once that's done and they have dried thoroughly, you can see here that the instructions are a little ambiguous as to exactly where they're located. In the first photo here, you don't really know whether part C44 fits inside the wheel well or supports the gear doors. And the instructions they make it look like a gear door actuating mechanism, but it doesn't quite fit where it's indicated in the instructions, so I left it where it just wanted to sit. And then in this last photo, you see the locating holes for kit part C34 are pretty obvious, as is the large hole for the main landing gear leg. That's part number 33. Installing the landing gear, the nose landing gear, is pretty much similar to the other landing gear. Just let the parts sit where they want to rest in their sockets, just ensuring that the main leg is vertical along the center line of the aircraft and on both sides the same way. So make sure that it's not leaning somewhere. And once the glue is good and dry on the landing gear struts, you can glue the gear bay doors into positions. Again, just make sure that they're straight and they fit properly in their nacelles. Next, the turrets were painted chrome silver, and the guns, of course, painted gunmetal. That's number 1795 paint. And then the observation blisters, they'll be added as well. Use some clear glue to add those and put those in place on the model. So another modeling tail. Before adding the 20mm cannon and the 250 caliber machine guns to the tail, I painted the canvas area tan using some Model Master dark tan enamel. That's 1742. And once it was dry, I installed the gun barrels, painted gunmetal as well, and broke off both of the 50 caliber gun barrels. Just careless, not paying attention when I turned it around, and they're very fragile. Now the carpet monster promptly ate them, so I had to replace them with some brass tubing, and I'll use some of the micro brass tubing made by Albion Alloys. And since this is a 172 scale 50 caliber gun is about 0.0069 inches down at 1/72, so they make a tubing that measures very close to that, so close enough to 2/10 of a millimeter. So I cut some of those off and painted them up, and they replaced the part perfectly. There are some pieces that are being added at this point in the model that you'll find some pin marks on. It's up to you whether to finish them off. You see here in the tire a couple that probably would have resulted in destroying some of the tread. Also here, part C12, which is our direction finding dome, but I didn't see where this was fitted to the B-50 anyway, so it's up to you whether to finish these off or omit them and blank over those locations. Sure enough, after I had applied the last 2 antennae to the upper fuselage, it was getting ready to call it a finished model, I noticed that one of the prop shafts had broken. Of course. So I decided to go ahead and use some small copper wire and find a drill bit about the same size to drill a hole in the center of the prop shaft and the center of the spinner, and then simply super glue them in, and called it good. That prop might not spin, but it's in the right place. So that would help bring both pieces together and reinforce that joint with a drop of super glue, and then we called it good. Well, there you have it. With a little extra elbow grease and some imagination and quite a bit of research, if you can find it, on this very important stopgap piece of aircraft power for the U.S. Air Force's entire bomber fleet, you can put it together and have a really nice looking display of what turned out to be the last prop driven aircraft bomber that was in use by the Air Force. And there's not a lot of information out there on the B-50, but it was in service for quite a while, even mostly as tankers and recon planes. But nonetheless, this very unusual kit is still available out there on the internet at online auction sites, etc. And there was a few problems. There's some finish that needs to be done. The molds were quite old. There's a few sinks, ejector pin marks, etc. But a little extra work, like I said, and look what you've got. A pretty darn nice looking bomber to add to your fleet. So if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. We hope you like this step-by-step premium scale model kit review. And so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do so by clicking on the ROR icon in the lower right hand corner of any of our reviews. You can find us on Facebook too, and our website rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.